All right, the next sensory system we're going to talk about is your sense of hearing. Right? We're going to talk about, again, the fact that sound travels in waveforms, and we're going to review really quick those two properties of sound waves. We're going to talk about the ear itself and then talk a little bit about hearing loss. So let's start with the idea of the stimulus. So the stimulus that's out in the world is sound waves. Sound waves are purely just air that is moving around. So when I clap my hands, together, what's happening is that it's pushing the air in a waveform. And that wave then hits your ear and is ultimately interpreted as the sound of clapping hands. So sound is purely moving air. Purely moving air. So how does your brain ultimately get to interpret what that moving air does? Well, it does so because of the complex structure of your ear. And just like I did before, I'm going to talk to you about the structure of the ear. Then I'm going to show you some definitions and let you write them down. But I'm going to talk through first while looking at the picture. Now, for the eyeball, I wanted you to be able to label it and tell me what it does. For the ear, you are not going to need to label it. You just need to know what the parts do. So, the big picture of the ear, you have an outer ear, a middle ear, and an inner ear. You can actually see part of the outer ear. It's those floppy things that stick off the side of your head. In my case, it's the things that I have earrings in today. All right, that's the outer ear. The formal name for it is called the pinna. All right, you don't need to know that, but it's just that floppy thing on the outer part of your ear. It leads to a canal. All right, that you've probably had earwax in before. And at the end of that canal is something called an eardrum. So the sound wave, the moving air, is going to come in. It's going to be filtered down into that tunnel. And it's going to ultimately go and interact with that eardrum. That's the outer ear. And that's the point and the goal of the outer ear, is to collect the sound and send it on in down that canal to the eardrum. Then you have the role of the middle ear. The middle ear is this tiny little chamber in between the outer ear and the inner ear, right? And it's made up of 3 tiny bones. In fact, the tiniest bones in your body, right? One of the names for them being the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, named sort of for what they look like. But the job of these 3 tiny bones are to move when the eardrum moves. So as the eardrum flexes back and forth, those little tiny bones move. And those little tiny bones will ultimately tap on the inner ear, all right, onto a specific part called the oval window, and it will tap out the pattern of the incoming airwaves. And what it's doing is it's tapping on this oval window, all right, onto the inner ear. And the biggest structure that we're going to talk about of the inner ear is this part here called the cochlea. It looks kind of like a snail because it's all coiled up, and it's filled with fluid. And so as the oval window gets tapped on, just as, for example, if you throw a rock into the water, it's going to create ripples. So as it gets tapped on, it's going to send ripples through the cochlea. And within the cochlea, you have these specialized receptors called hair cells, because they sort of look like little hairs, although you really have to have a microscope to zoom in and see them. But those hair cells are floating in the water. And just kind of like with seaweed or some other kind of plant that's in the water, as the ripple comes, right, the plant kind of bends over and it waves in the water. And every time it waves and bends, that's what causes an action potential, and that action potential then gets sent to the brain. And again, each one of these little hair cells is a specialized neuron. All right, the actual part that's sticking out is the specialized dendrite. Every time it bends, it will cause an action potential to go down the axon. All of those axons, similarly to the eye, will travel together to the brain in one big clump called the auditory nerve. All right, so sound comes in, gets funneled down to the eardrum. The eardrum takes advantage of these 3 little bones in the middle ear. Those little bones tap on the inner ear, and that tapping produces ripples in the liquid that's in the cochlea, and that moves those hair cells, and that's what helps you to hear. Does that make sense? All right, again, I'm going to encourage you to pause, and I'm going to encourage you to write down these definitions. A little bit more about the cochlea. So the cochlea, as I said, is in the inner ear. All right, so here's the sound waves coming in the outer ear. Here's the eardrum. Here's those three tiny little bones that are tapping onto the oval window. And again, as they tap, it sends ripples, all right, in this fluid that's in the cochlea. And those hair cells bend over, and as they bend over, that produces action potentials that are sent along all of these axons out together through the auditory nerve to be processed. And it's ultimately going to get to the brain, and it's going to be processed in the temporal lobe. So remember, visual information was in the back in the occipital lobe. Auditory information is in the side in the temporal lobe. So the cochlea's job, all right, is to house those specialized hair cells that ultimately will help you to hear sounds. Now, we talked about the fact that air travels in waves. So just like we talked about with light, we're going to need to talk about the two things. The first one is, let's start kind of backwards this time, amplitude, how tall the waves are. A taller wave coming in is going to produce a louder sound. A smaller wave coming in is going to produce a softer sound. All right, so that when you're yelling to somebody across campus, hey, how you doing? You want to go get a cup of coffee? You're going to make a higher amplitude of basically moving air with your vocal cords so that person hears a louder sound. Right? When you're sitting in class in the back and you're whispering and you don't want the teacher to hear you, and you're whispering really softly, right? You're using a smaller amplitude. You're making a smaller amplitude of air coming out of your vocal cords, right? So that it will ultimately be perceived, right, as a softer sound or a quieter sound. So that's intensity, right? Loudness is actually important, right? Too much intensity, too much loudness, and sometimes it's also measured as decibels, can actually be dangerous and can start to damage your inner ear. Right? So normal conversation is about 60 decibels. Usually when I'm speaking in a classroom, I'm speaking a little bit louder, probably more towards 70 decibels. If I've been speaking too loud on these PowerPoint presentations, you probably turn the sound down on your computer, which makes total sense. All right. Whispering to somebody is pretty quiet. That's about 20 decibels. We consider 0 to be the threshold of hearing. So anything below 0, obviously you wouldn't be able to hear. 0 means you can't hear it. So anything above that is stuff you can hear. A very busy street corner with lots of traffic and honking and engines and all that stuff's about 80. And the reason this little wavy line is here is because anything above that for an extended period of time can actually start to cause hearing loss. All right, so subway trains are super loud. All right, thunder can be really loud. Here's the one that's most dangerous to most people. It doesn't have to be a rock band, but any sort of concert that you might go to, those speakers that they use put out upwards of 140 decibels of sound. Right? If you've ever been to some sort of concert and then afterwards you found that you and your friends were yelling at each other like, that was a really great concert, don't you think? The reason you were speaking so loud is because you actually slightly damaged your inner ear and you made it harder for your inner ear to process softer or quieter sounds. Now, luckily, if you don't do that often, your ear can heal and you will ultimately go back and you'll be fine and you'll be able to hear things again. But if you do this for an extended period of time, you can cause permanent damage. This is why at most loud concerts, you'll even see the musicians and everybody will actually have earplugs in. That's not just for hearing what's going on. That's also to dampen some of the sounds so that they don't have permanent hearing loss. All right, the second quality of moving air is the wavelength. If you remember, we said for color, right? If the wavelength from the top of one to the top of the next was pretty short, we would see blues and purples. If the top of one to the top of the next was long, we would see more red colors. Similarly with sound, this time what wavelength gives us is high-pitched sounds or low-pitched sounds. So my daughter loves watching My Little Ponies. All right, those little ponies talk with very short wavelengths. So all of their voices are like this, and it's really, really annoying after about 2 or 3 hours of My Little Ponies. So if you can imagine, that's the short wavelength. They speak with those really short wavelengths, which gives high-pitched sounds. Now, a lot of us like bass, and we like to hear a lot of bass in our music. What we are enjoying, what we're appreciating is the longer wavelength, that bass sound, those deep tones and those deep sounds. So that's what frequency gives us, or wavelength gives us, with regard to sound. One last cool thing about sound is the fact that you can tell where sounds come from, and I'm going to tell you why. You can tell where sounds come from mostly because of those weird floppy things that you have on the outside of your head. They're called the pinna again, as I told you before. All right? But here's what can happen. As sound waves are coming at you, all right, if the sound wave is straight in front of you and coming straight at you, it is going to hit both of your ears at exactly the same time. And your brain has a particular brain region that measures that and goes, oh, that means something is right in front of me. Right? If something is straight behind you, it's still going to hit the ears at the same time, but it's going to be a little bit different than if it was in the front because your earlobes stick out a little bit. So the sound is going to hit the earlobe a little bit differently and go into your ear a little bit differently, and your brain can perceive that as, oh, something is behind me. Right? If it goes into one ear first and then has to go around your head before it can get into the other ear, you're going to know, oh, the sound came from that side. And then same thing with the other. So you can localize where sounds are coming from, and you're actually really good at this because you have 2 ears and because you have those floppy things sticking off of your ears. All right, we are almost done. I have 10 slides left. And I tell you that to make this point, right? We know the most about we know the most about sight, and we know the most about sound. We are still actively learning more about all of the different sensory systems, but we don't know nearly as much about some of these other sensory systems. Now, what I'm going to hypothesize is that in about 5 to 10 years, we are no longer going to consider pain a sense of touch. Pain is going to end up becoming its own sensory system, just like we have a few other sensory systems that we're not covering in this class. But for now, touch and pain are going to be covered together. And then I'm actually also going to group taste and smell together. And the reason I'm going to group them together is because they are both what we call chemical senses. They are detecting chemicals either in the air that goes up in your nose, or in the food or the air that goes into your mouth. So we'll come up to those. So let's start with touch first. Touch is a really weird sort of sensation because it's actually a mix of 4 different things. It's a mix of pressure, so stuff physically putting pressure onto your skin, for example. It's a mixture of warmth and cold. And please note that I said warm and cold and not hot and cold. Warm and cold, and pain. Right? So touch is a mixture of 4 different skin senses, and you can detect all different kinds of different things. Now, oddly enough, pressure is the only one that has identifiable receptors. So if I was to take a chunk of your skin and look at it under a microscope, I really can only find identifiable receptors for touch, for pressure. All right, and you have several different kinds. For physical pressure, if something's vibrating your skin, you actually have 2 different kinds of things that can pick that up. And then everything else, cold, warm, and pain, is sort of a combination of all of the rest of those. But here's why I specifically said warm and cold. All right, you do have specific receptors, although they're really hard to identify, in your skin that can tell when something's cold. So if you touch an ice cube and if you try to hold it in your hand for any length of time, you're going to go, ooh, 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 that's cold. You're going to want to put it down. All right? If you touch something warm, most people like to take a warm shower. You're going to like, oh, that feels good on my skin. That helps me relax. Yay. But here's what's really strange. Right? We don't have a receptor for hot. Right? You would think we would, because hot is what's going to cause problems. I mean, cold can cause problems too, but why don't we have one for hot? Well, here's what happens. And this is an experiment you could actually do. If you hold a tube of cold water and a tube of warm water, and I legitimately mean warm, so just normal room temperature kind of water at the same time, both your cold and your warm receptors are going to be activated. And they're both going to send a message to the brain saying, I feel cold, I feel warm. And your brain's going to go, oh, I don't know who to listen to. Ow, hot! And your brain will experience the sensation of hot. All right, so now it might make a little more sense why we don't have a receptor for hot. Hot indicates something is wrong. Hot is leading us to that next thing we're going to talk about, which is pain. Because usually if something is hot, it's causing damage, and damage causes pain. All right? It's a really, really weird phenomenon. And I'm going to give you an even weirder example of this idea of hot in just a second. So I currently have an uncle who had stage 3 colon cancer. He is doing as well as he possibly can, so thank you if you are sending me well wishes and sending him well wishes. But the reason I am bringing him up is this, one of these very weird side effects that most people don't even know happens after chemotherapy is that your temperature sensations sort of get kind of hyperactivated after chemotherapy. That's just one of the side effects of chemotherapy. And so you are constantly, right, feeling warm, right? Everything feels warm to you, which is normally not a problem, right? You just say, hey, I'm just feeling a little bit hot. So you just put on a t-shirt instead of a long sleeve shirt. You put on shorts instead of long pants, and you're usually comfortable, no problem. Right? But think about it. Think about what I just told you. If you're feeling warm and your warm receptors are activated and you touch something that is cold, what message does your brain get? Does your message get the message of warm? No. Does it get the message of cold? No. Well, technically, yes, it got both. But what does it make you experience? What do you perceive? Well, you perceive hot. And my uncle has said that this has been the weirdest sensation. He has to drink room temperature liquids. He cannot drink cold, like ice water or anything like that, because if he does, because his warm receptors are already activated, when he drinks the cold water, it feels like his throat is on fire. He said the weirdest one the other day is they have a tile kitchen, and he said it was early in the morning and the tile was pretty cool. And he said as he was walking across the tile in the kitchen to go to the refrigerator to get something to eat for breakfast, it felt like his feet were burning. It felt like he was walking on top of a hot stove. Again, because his warm receptors are overactivated because of the chemotherapy, and his cold receptors were getting activated because of the cold tile. And so he was experiencing this weird burning sensation, even though he wasn't being burned at all. So he said it was very, very weird. All right, so let's lead that up into pain. Let's talk about pain for a minute. Pain is an interesting sense. Pain tells us that something has gone wrong. Usually when you feel pain, it's because something has been damaged, either the skin or some other sort of internal tissue, right? And why is that important? Well, it lets you know that you need to stop whatever it is that you're doing, or you need to pay attention to whatever it is because it needs to be fixed or it needs help. So pain is a very important message that says something is wrong, pay attention, take care of me. Right? There are rare diseases that do exist in which the afflicted person doesn't feel any pain. And I've given you an example here. This was, I'm not sure if it was from this textbook or the last, but I really liked this case study, and you can read more about this if you Google this online. But the little girl here on the right doesn't feel pain at all. She doesn't feel hot or cold very well either. So she's got a little bit of temperature issues that are messed up too, but she doesn't feel any pain. And so her mother has to be extremely aware and extremely cautious of what her daughter does. And think about that. Think about why her mother might need to be extra vigilant. What do you think could happen if this little girl doesn't feel pain? Well, she could get hurt and not know it. She could touch something that's burning her skin and wouldn't have the reaction to move her hand away and could get serious damage. right? She could get some sort of infection and not even know it's infected because it wouldn't hurt until it's too late to fix or get rid of the infection. So while nobody really enjoys experiencing pain, pain is actually a very important sense because it tells us you're getting close to injuring yourself or you've already injured yourself and you need to stop and take care of whatever it is. All right, my next slide is a review slide about the biopsychosocial influences. So this goes back to the very first lecture that we did. And we said that when you are looking at any sort of behavior or any sort of mental process, you can look at it sort of in 3 different ways. Again, this is purely a review. And the way I'm going to review it is by looking at the concept of pain. All right, so here are some things that we know. From a biological perspective, we know that people can experience pain differently because of the people's spinal cord. Everybody's spinal cord is slightly different, and there are these fibers called large fibers and small fibers, and depending on which combination you have will determine whether or not you feel more or less pain. Other people produce different levels of endorphins. Endorphins are your body's natural pain relievers. Right? Some people produce a lot, some people produce a little bit. Right? And some people's brain is more hyperactive when a pain signal is sent than other people's. So there's biological reasons why somebody might experience pain differently than somebody else, even if they have the same injury. There's also psychological influences that can influence pain. The first one is attention, whether or not you're paying attention to it. I used to take advantage of this when my child was younger. Whenever she would get hurt, all right, I would always just try to distract her, depending on, the amount she got hurt. If it was something serious, obviously I would take advantage of it. But if she just fell and got a little boo-boo, I would go, oh, I'm sorry. And then I would immediately try to distract her by, hey, why don't we go look at this? Or why don't we go read a book? Or in other words, I would try to turn her attention to something else. And as long as she was paying attention to something else, it didn't usually hurt. This is also one of the reasons why people say they experience the most pain at night, because at night you're not as readily able to pay attention to other stuff, so all you really have to focus on is the pain. There's also learning based on experience, right? You can learn that things hurt, and that can make the pain feel worse or make the pain feel different. People that are afraid of shots are very acutely aware of this. They know that that shot's going to hurt, and I can guarantee you that it will legitimately hurt them more than somebody else, all right, just because of that psychological factor. And you can actually have a psychological expectation of pain relief. This is why placebo medications can work. A placebo medication is I give you something that looks like a medication, but it doesn't actually have any medicine in it. But if you think that there's medicine in it, you can actually experience true, legitimate pain relief. It's pretty interesting. And then the third way that we can look at pain is by looking at social and cultural influences. There's actually a pretty terrible example of this in some parts of American culture, right? Are boys supposed to admit that they feel pain? Most people would say no. They tell things like, suck it up, be a man, boys don't cry. They say things like that. And again, I totally don't agree with that, but that can definitely influence how somebody might respond to pain. Right? And there might even thus be a gender difference that doesn't really exist, except for that we were culturally taught that the genders are allowed to experience pain differently. We also know that if there's a bunch of other people around you experiencing pain, right, your pain is going to feel worse. This is why they try to keep you isolated in a hospital as best they can, not just so that you're not getting exposed to other diseases and illnesses, but also because psychologically, seeing somebody else in pain can actually make your pain feel worse. And then there's other cultural expectations related to the idea of empathy, right? Like if I see somebody hurting, it hurts me. A fairly interesting example of this, there's a TV show, or at least there was a TV show a long time ago called America's Funniest Home Videos. And I remember very distinctly this one particular video. It was some sort of like picnic or outdoor gathering where there were a whole bunch of individuals, multiple adults and multiple children. And in this particular video, one little boy is riding on his bicycle and he runs into one of the males, one of the adult males, and hits him right in the crotch. So right in his very, very sensitive crotch area. And so, of course, the man that gets hit is obviously going to experience pain because that's a very painful situation. But what I noticed in the video is that all of the other adult males also grabbed their crotch region and acted like it hurt, almost as if they knew what that would have felt like if that had been them. That's a social cultural influence. We can feel empathy for others' pain because we can either remember what it has felt like in the past or we can imagine what it would feel like. Does that make sense? Does that help with the review of how you can look at an issue from 3 different perspectives? And as we know, any one person's experience of pain isn't usually just based on one of these things. It's usually a combination of all of these 3 factors. A couple other things about pain. All right, there's something called the gate control theory. The basic idea of this is that your spinal cord is a gate. Your spinal cord will determine whether or not the pain message is allowed to be sent to the brain. And if the pain message doesn't reach the brain, you are not going to perceive the pain. That's actually how some painkillers work, right? Is by blocking the pain signal from being sent to the brain. Probably the most obvious example of this is women that choose to have an epidural during labor. All right, what an epidural is they insert, right, a little cannula, all right, usually about midway through your spine into your actual spinal cord, and they put medication in there that blocks the pain signal. So that the whole top half of the woman's body is able to be moved, is able to feel, is able to sense, but the bottom half of the woman's body, even though it's not like the pain's not there, right? There's still a baby coming out of the woman's body, right? But the pain signal from that isn't going to actually be sent to the brain. And so the woman gets pain relief simply because the message was blocked at the level of the spinal cord. We also know that pain can be controlled by a lot of different things. We do know that some medications work. We've talked about a few of those. But there's actually some other cool things that can control pain. Some newer things are looking at the idea of surgery. In other words, physically damaging the neurons that are sending pain signals so that they no longer send it. We know that acupuncture works, although science hasn't quite caught up yet with exactly how. We don't know if it's some sort of distraction technique or if it's something about the way that it reduces inflammation, but it works. We just don't quite know why yet. But acupuncture can be used to relieve pain. Exercise can actually be used to relieve pain, and exercise is kind of a cool double sort of thing. Exercise can cause you to release endorphins, which are your natural painkillers, but exercise can also stretch out, relax, relieve tension that's in muscles. So depending on exactly what's causing you the pain, exercise can actually be good for that. And then my favorite one are hypnosis and thought distraction. Basically, if you don't want to feel pain, try to think about something else. This is always why if somebody's in the hospital and they're having some sort of procedure and they're in pain, it's always good to try to take something and do something they have something to distract themselves, something to read, something to watch on TV, somebody to talk to, something that they can do like knitting or something with their hands so that they can be distracted and not pay attention to the pain. All right, I promise we're almost done here. Thanks for hanging with me. The last two are our chemical senses. So the first one that we're going to talk about is taste. Taste originally had 4 that you probably learned about: sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. We have officially added a 5th, which is called umami. The reason we use the Japanese word is because we don't really have an English word that's equivalent to it, so we just use the Japanese word. And there's actually even a 6th one that's being debated, so I'm going to bet in a few years I'm going to be adding a 6th one to this list. But nonetheless, we'll go with these 5 that are in your textbook. taste is actually relatively simple. There are not a lot of things that your tongue can actually detect. Your tongue can tell if something is sweet. It can tell if something is sour. It can tell if something is salty. And it can tell if something is umami. I'm going to skip bitter for a minute. It can tell if something is umami. The best way I can sort of explain this is sort of that fat, oil, meat sort of taste. There's actually a chemical there, but again, we don't have a word for that in English, so we just call it umami. And we also can detect bitter. Now, bitter is different from sour. Sour is just, ooh, that's a little sour like a lemon. Bitter typically, and historically, evolutionarily speaking, meant something was poisonous, which is why I hate the fact that they used coffee, because I love coffee. I even joke that my blood type is coffee, as the example of bitter. Some people do claim that coffee is bitter. Yes, but coffee is not poisonous. But for example, a lot of poisonous berries and things that you wouldn't want to eat would have a very bitter taste. And the reason that is, and the reason why that worked evolutionarily, is because if something tasted bitter, most of the time you wouldn't keep eating it. You would spit it out, try to get it out of your mouth. All right, and that was very good for our ancient ancestors because hopefully they would get it out and it wouldn't get in their system and it wouldn't actually poison them. So bitter is a little bit important in that way. Bitter can also tell us if something has gone bad, like it's been spoiled, again, usually indicating that it can somehow harm us. But that's about it. That's about all there is to taste. You have some taste buds on your tongue. They're little gatherings. If you wanted to do a cool experiment, go get some blue food coloring or eat a blue sucker that's got blue food coloring in it. Get all that blue all over your tongue and then go to a mirror and stick your tongue out. And what you will see is that taste buds don't absorb the blue dye. So what you're going to see is you'll have a bunch of pink little dots left on your tongue. Those are all your taste buds. Those are all the things that are housing hundreds and hundreds of taste receptors that are going to help you to determine if something's sweet, sour, salty, bitter, or umami. So a lot of people at this point go, well, Dr. West, hold on. If taste is that simple, then how do I taste so many things? I mean, I love food. I love all the different flavors of food, and I love all different kinds of stuff. Why is taste so simple? Well, it's because taste isn't really taste. What you're thinking of when you think of food and you think of flavor isn't just taste. What's actually going on is something called sensory interaction. Sensory interaction is when one sense affects another sense. And the most common example of this in humans is our sense of taste and smell. When people say, I like the flavor of something, most likely actually what they're focusing on is not really the taste of it, but the smell of it. All right? Because when you put food in your mouth, all right, not only are you tasting it with your tongue, but all the chemical actually kind of goes up through the back of your throat into your sinuses, as well as before you even put it in your mouth, the smell goes into your nose, and you're able to then smell the food that you are eating. All right? This is called sensory interaction. There's a really cool experiment, and I'm going to make a video of it to show you guys, where if you actually shut your nose and quickly put a sucker in your mouth and you keep your eyes closed, you can't tell what flavor that sucker is. You actually need your sense of smell to determine the flavor of the sucker. So look forward to that video. I'm going to pick on one of my family members and have them help me make that video for you. This is also, again, to do a little bit more of a current event sort of thing, something that's very scary for people that have the COVID-19 virus. One of the things that people are saying is that they're losing their sense of smell. The most recent research that I have read shows that it's actually some sort of inflammation and some sort of damage that's happening to the actual smell receptors. So let me show you those really quick. So like smell, taste is like taste, smell is a chemical sense. So stuff enters into your sinuses. Now, normally it goes in through your nose, but it can enter the sinuses through the back way, through the back of your mouth and up into your sinuses. But there's all kinds of stuff that's floating around in the air, all kinds of chemicals. Some of those chemicals we like the smell of. So for example, this person is smelling a rose here. We like certain perfumes. We like the way certain foods smell. All right, and then there's other things that we do not like the smell of. Like I can tell you right now, I hate the smell of stinky feet. That I don't even know how to describe it. It's just gross. All right, so for me, that's a smell that I just absolutely hate. So whenever that chemical unfortunately happens to get anywhere near my nose, it's like, oh, gross, terrible. All right, we are able to detect at least 5 million, we have at least 5 million different receptors to sense smell. So we can differentiate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of smells. Believe it or not, that's not very sensitive. Dogs, rats that I was telling you about before in some of my other lectures have even more ability. They can do tens of thousands, of different smells. All right, so smell is actually a lot more sensitive. All right, but because it's combined with taste, that's what gives us this concept of flavor, which is the part that we really enjoy. Now, going back to the COVID-19 virus, what people are losing is their sense of smell, mostly because their olfactory receptors, so these are the specialized neurons that have specialized dendrites that stick out, all right, that as the air comes in with all those chemicals, it traps the chemical there, and that's what initiates the action potential, all right, that is sent to something called the olfactory bulb, which is then sent up into your brain. Right? But those are what are being damaged. We think it's an inflammation issue, but for whatever reason, the olfactory cells get damaged fairly rapidly, and individuals that are experiencing the COVID-19 virus say that they cannot smell things. And as a result, as you might imagine from what I just told you, it affects the taste of their food because they can't smell their food. So it's a very, very weird phenomenon. We don't yet know enough to know if this will be permanent damage. In general, on a normal day, your tongue and the receptors in your nose can replenish themselves, and they do so fairly regularly. The cells on your tongue are constantly dying, particularly if you've ever burned your tongue with some hot food. You didn't lose your sense of taste forever. Eventually, those cells regrew, and that's good. Same thing in your nose. Those cells eventually regrow. But what we don't know is in an unnatural situation, so something like COVID-19, whether or not you can have enough regrowth to regain your sense of smell entirely. So that's something that we're going to have to be looking for as the research comes out. One final interesting tidbit about smell. Have you ever smelled something and it made you think about a place or a person, like you smelled a cologne or a perfume and it made you think about a person? Yeah? Well, there's a reason for that. All right? I told you before that all of your sensory systems are coming in through the reticular formation. They go to the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends it to the correct place to be processed. So the occipital lobe for vision, the parietal lobe for touch, the temporal lobe for sound. There's one exception. Now, smell will ultimately go to the thalamus, right? So it isn't exempt from the pattern, but before it goes to the thalamus, it actually goes through your limbic system. And if you remember, the limbic system was responsible for a number of things, but one of them was memory. This is why smells get paired up with memories so easily. Everybody's got one. Even if you don't know that you've made that memory connection, you've probably got some smell that if you ever smelled it again, it would make you think of a place, or it would make you think of a person, or it would make you think of an event. A very obvious one for a lot of people is they smell that sort of coconut sunscreen smell. Most people are going to think about the beach or think about a pool. Why? Probably because that's where you used that product, right? But without even trying to, you connected that smell with a memory. All right, guys, that was a lot. Thanks for hanging with me. But that is all we are going to do for Unit 1. Let me know if you have any questions.